Hello, folks. Welcome to Reality Check with Arvind Swaminathan. This is your host again, Arvind Swaminathan. Today, we're going to talk about the history of banking and how it sort of fits in with the New World Order, which we've heard so much about over the last 20 or 30 years. It's now beginning to take shape, whether we like it or not, unless we actively try and do something about it. It's going to take us over. Now, what do I mean by the New World Order? Well, it's something which we've been aware of, but haven't really experienced because of certain, how shall I put it, disturbances, times when people, it was felt that people were not ready for it. Now, the New World Order simply means a few people or a few families will control everything on this earth. Now, one of the biggest things that came up and should have been a clue a long time ago was UN itself. However, for that, a whole lot of other things needed to be in place. People had to be indoctrinated, there had to be control over people's health and everything else, and most important, their jobs and especially their money. Now, once money is in their control, most of the other things will follow. Without that, it cannot happen. And this is where the control of the world by the banking fraternity that comes in. Now, leading up to this world order, it goes back a long, long way. Four incidents happened which have brought us to this particular point. The first one was there used to be a kingdom known as Khazaria, which existed between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. At its time, or in its time, it was the largest kingdom in Europe. It was also perhaps the strongest because their stock in trade was they had a very powerful army which was for hire. It was a mercenary army. Anybody could hire it. You paid your fee to the king. He gave you the army, fought for you. And the thing is, they always won. It was a foregone conclusion. Nobody could stand up against them. But once they won, they pillaged, looted, plundered, took slaves, everything, and took it back to Khazaria. What was left was then the person who hired this army could now rule over. Now, this particular kingdom didn't have a state religion. They were, how shall I put it, godless. And they were always under pressure from the north and west to adopt Christianity, from the south to adopt Islam. Now, the king of Khazaria, he discussed this with Christians, with Muslims, even Jews, and everything else. And finally decided on adopting Judaism. And that became the state religion for Khazaria. But it was not the sort of Judaism you found in the former Holy Land or Syria or anywhere there. Those people were Sephardic Jews. They followed the Torah. These people adopted Talmudic Judaism, which means they followed the Torah, the Talmud, which has a few very odd characteristics. Talmudic Jews, for instance, don't believe that anybody else is a human. Only they are human. If they take something from anybody else, it belongs to them. It no longer belongs to the original owner. And they have no right to fight back or even ask for it. If this human or this Talmudic Jew even kills somebody else, it's no problem. He wasn't even a human being, so why should anybody be bothered? But you touch him and you'll die. You will end up dead because they will take action. Now, under these circumstances, they continued warring, plundering, loot, and everything else. until a bunch of Vikings coming in from the north halted their progress. They did not win this time. In fact, it was a slight defeat. They were pushed back. That's where the doubts began. Shortly after that, Genghis Khan's golden hordes came in from the east and gave them one hell of a hiding. Because the strategy adopted by those people from the east was something they'd never come across before. The Mongol archers with this particular army, Genghis Khan's army, were a sort of mounted commando force. They could fire 6 arrows in a minute, riding at a full gallop. 5 of them would hit a person in a lethal spot. The sixth one, he would take longer to die, but it would still hit somebody. That made mincemeat of these Khazars. The result was almost too difficult to imagine or too impossible to imagine. They decided this is not the place for them anymore. No more fighting because you'll always find somebody who's stronger than you are. So they migrated en masse. Many remained Jewish, they remained Talmudic Jews, many adopted Christianity. But they moved from there and the kingdom just ceased to exist. Now, very little is known about Khazaria and they've kept it that way. But you see, large chunks of this population moved to places like Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, Austria. A few went into Germany. One lot went south. They went along the Mediterranean coast, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal. Now, one of the things that gave them this problem with the people from the east, they had something called stirrups on their riders. Now, this enabled this flexibility to turn around and slide over the side and fire arrows because they didn't need to maneuver a horse with their hands. It's something they had not come across before. So it was this invention which destroyed them. Having gone to Spain, Portugal, and Italy, please remember this because this becomes very important a little later on. I'll explain how. This was the first event. The second event was having been pushed out of the Holy Land, the Templar Knights lost their aura of invincibility in Europe. Even though they were very wealthy, very strong, very powerful, they would lend money to kings. And one of them, unfortunately, turned out to be their nemesis. Philip IV of France had borrowed so much money from these Templar Knights, he knew he could never repay. So, what was his solution? He outlawed them, and then he went after each one of them. They were arrested, they were tortured, they were burnt at the stake, they were executed. All of them with one thing in mind. He wanted to find out where was the Templar treasure. That way, not only would his debts be finished, but he would get the entire wealth for his future use. But of course, he never did. He went and attacked their last stronghold on a Friday the 13th in 1307. Hence, 13 and Friday the 13th is considered a very inauspicious number or figure or date. He got all of them, but when he got there, he found open but empty vaults. The treasure had vanished. Where did it go? Nobody knows. But it is also known that 13 of those Templar Knights escaped. Now, not only did they take their treasure with them, but These Templar Knights had a virtual navy, both men of war as well as merchant ships. When they disappeared, they took all this with them. From France, they moved to Spain and Portugal. As long as they remained in Spain and Portugal prospered in more ways than one. First, they started pushing the Moors back. Because remember, around that time, the Moors or the Muslims ruled a good chunk of Spain. They started pushing them back and back into North Africa. Not only that, the ships provided also were very, very good for trade and protection of that marine shipping, of that marine trade. Now, this one we will have to remember because it comes in a little later on. We're still in that second event. The third event was in 1421 when the ruler of Egypt decreed there should be no infidels found south of Cairo. If he was, there's no way that he would escape the death penalty. Now, this had a very big impact on Europe because the spice trade was operated and monopolized by Genoese traders or merchants working out of Genoa in Italy via the Mediterranean into the Persian Gulf and from there to India, Kerala being one of the centers, Calicut in particular. This trade was cut immediately. That's when everything else turned and everybody started looking for a route to the East Indies or the Spice Islands. Whether it was the Italians, the Spanish, the Portuguese, everybody started looking for them. And how did they go about it? Well, the only people who had the money were either the Templars or the Jews. The Jews and the Templars started working together in tandem. And what happened? All these so-called voyages of discovery were financed by them. And who profited most? Because they were based in Spain and Portugal, it was the Spanish and the Portuguese who prospered. Because it was their shipping and their ships and their finance which helped them. If you look at pictures of all the ships of, say, Columbus or Magellan or Vasco da Gama, they all carried a cross on their sail. But this was not a Christian cross. It was a Templar cross. There's a big difference between the two. I mean, that tells you that it was the Templars who were the main financiers of these voyages. You can understand because these were all men of war. You can now understand why Spain and Portugal were so powerful. They were world powers at the time. Not Britain or anybody else, but Spain and Portugal. From that, you can see that once they discovered the Americas, North and South America, the Pope drew a line on the maps. Brazil went to Portugal. Spain took over Argentina, the western South American countries like Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia. They also took over Central America, Mexico, a good chunk of what was Texas, which English speaking finally took back or took away from it. Now, Spain having taken over so much, Brazil went to Portugal, but Portuguese also went round the coast of Africa towards the east, and Vasco da Gama landed at Calicut or Coricode as it is today. All this was done thanks to finance from the Templars, and they all carried the Templar cross on their sails. All these were voyages of discovery looking for the Spice Islands. And if they found it, Spain and Portugal would be kings of the world, rulers of the world. Now, Vasco da Gama found part of it, but not the source. Something else happened which changed the course of history again. Once all this had begun, the one thing that nobody wanted began. It was the Spanish Inquisition. For some reason or other, even though the Templars were Roman Catholics, they fell foul of the Pope. And they had to leave Spain and Portugal in a hurry. Now, once they left, they took their ships with them and their wealth. The next we hear of them is they settled in Holland, which was then a Spanish colony, by the way. They helped them to shake off the Spanish yoke. And the other place was in England. Now, England is the important bit because they settled in that 1 square mile known as the City of London. Now, this is unique because the City of London does not owe allegiance to the British Crown or the British government. It is affiliated with today the Vatican. Even then, it was affiliated with popes and papal order and method. The result is it has always had its own police force, it has its own rules and regulations and its own government, which the British Crown has no control over. Now, once they've settled there and in Holland, the balance of power shifted from Spain and Portugal to England and Holland. They went on their voyages of discovery. They took over East Africa. Well, the British took over East Africa. They took over eventually India, Malaysia, Singapore, Berlin, Burma, into Hong Kong, Australia, and New Zealand. The Dutch went to the Indonesian islands and they stayed there until the 1940s. They tried to come in and take over a part of India, but around the Travancore-Cochin coast, they got such a hiding they never bothered to come back. Now, the City of London is unique because, as I said, it has its own laws. Even today, every major bank has at least a small branch there. And this is where the Templars seem to have settled, because here they were untroubled. They financed both the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, which is why they managed to go so far east and get so much wealth from there, and the Dutch could manage to take over Indonesia. Now, the fact that the City of London is so totally removed from England itself, it is beyond the control of anybody except themselves. And the Templars just loved this because now their wealth was safe, because they had papal protection as well as British or English protection, and they had their own naval power. Now, this is important because this is where banking truly began. The Templars were the first bankers. And how did they do this? They opened branches in England, say in most of the European capitals. You could deposit your money in London. They'd give you a paper with certain codes on it. You could go anywhere in Europe where there was a branch, withdraw money for your expenses. They would enter it in there. You'd finish your travels and come back to London. You'd present this piece of paper. You got back what was the balance minus their commission. This is how basically banking began. Until earlier, it used to always be usury. Simply you go and collect a loan, pay interest, and then redeem whatever you had pledged. But this is the beginnings of banking as we know it today. This is also where the foundation of the banking empire as we know it today was laid. Without this particular protection and this particular non-interference, it could never have happened. Plus, there's one other big secret for its success: total secrecy. very little information came out. So people didn't know that this initially was the center. And this is where eventually the Rothschild empire began to really take off. I think we better stop here. And the final bit of the banking empires, which took off from here, we will discuss in the next video. In the next video, we will go much further into the details of the banking empire, the families that control these banks and this banking empire, how they've decided to go about taking over the world and establishing firmly what has been bandied about as the New World Order. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed what you heard, because I think the history behind all this is as important as the thing itself. If you like it, please press the like button. Reality check with Arvind Swaminathan. And please share it with all your friends, relatives, and your different groups. See you next week. Ciao.